Hello and welcome to another section of this complete Angular course. In this section, we are going to learn all about reactive forms. And let's start this section by understanding what is a reactive form and how to create a reactive form. So in the last section, we learned about template-driven forms. And there we learned that when we define a template-driven form, everything we do in the view template. But in a reactive form, we define the form and the form controls by writing some code. And that's what we are going to do in this section. We are going to create a form by writing some code. Now you might ask, why can't we use a simple HTML form in Angular and use it? Well, that's because using Angular, we create a single page application. So there should not be any submitting of form data to the server directly when the submit button in the form is clicked. But if we simply use an HTML form in our Angular application, in that case, when the submit button will be clicked in the form, that is going to submit the form by making a new request to the server. And when a new request to the server will be made, it will reload the page. And since using Angular we create a single page application, that means the whole Angular application will be reloaded. It will be restarted. That's why we need Angular's help to avoid the default behavior. And not only that, Angular also makes it easier to read the form control data and perform validation on the form controls and many more things when we use template driven approach or reactive form approach. Now we know that in Angular we can create forms using two approaches, either by using template driven approach or by using reactive form approach. And we have already talked about template driven approach in great detail in our previous section. Now in this section, we will learn how we can create forms and form controls using reactive form approach. Now, when we use reactive form approach, we define the structure of the form in the component class. That means we create the form model with form groups, form controls, and form arrays in the component class. And we also define the validation rules in the component class itself by writing some code. And then we need to bind the form group and form control which we have created in our component class to the HTML form in the view template. And we are going to understand this with an example. So the difference between a template driven form and a reactive form is that in a template driven form, we do most of the things in the view template itself. But in a reactive form, we create the form group and form control in the component class, and then we somehow synchronize it with the HTML form which we have defined in the view template. Now, the advantage of using a reactive form is that since we are going to define the form and form controls by writing some code, as a developer, we will have more control over how the form and the form control should be displayed. And using reactive form approach, creating dynamic controls also becomes easier. And when we use reactive form approach, unit testing is also easy. Now, the disadvantage of using reactive form is that since we are going to do most of the things by writing some code, it is not beginner friendly. Alright, so this was a high level overview of what a reactive form is and what are its advantages and disadvantages. Now, in order to work with reactive form, we need to import reactive form modules from Angular/forms library. So when we work with template driven form, there we import forms module from the Angular/forms library. But when we are working with reactive forms, in that case, we need to import reactive forms module from Angular/forms. Now, let's go ahead and let's see how we can create a reactive form in Angular. To understand reactive forms, here I have created a brand new Angular project called Angular Reactive Form. Now, in this project, if I open this source folder, there if I go to this app folder, here I have not created any other component. We only have one component called app component. And in the HTML file of that app component, I have written some HTML. Basically, here I am defining a form using this form element. So keep in mind that even if in a reactive form approach, you're going to create a form by writing some code, still you need to define the form by using the form element of HTML. So here you see I'm using this form element, and inside this form element, I'm defining some input elements like first name, last name, email, then username, date of birth, gender, etc. And in order to design this HTML, in order to design this form, I've also written some CSS. So this HTML and this CSS you will find with the startup project, and the link for the startup project I have already provided in the description. Okay, so if I go to the web page, This is how the form will look like. There you will see that we have this first name input element, we have this last name input element, we have this email input element, username, date of birth, gender, street address, country, city, region, and postal code. So we are going to use this HTML form and we are going to make it a reactive form. Let's see how we can do that. So let's again go back to VS Code. And as I mentioned earlier, in order to work with reactive form, the first thing which we need to do is we need to go to app modules, and there we need to import reactive form module from Angular/forms. So this is the first step. Let's save this file here and let's close this app module.ts file. Now, in a reactive form, we define the form structure in the component class. Now, we have created the HTML form in the app component.html. So, in the app component class, we are going to create a form. So here, let's create a property. Let's call it reactive form. You can name it anything. You can also call it sign up form or registration form. But here I'm going to call it as reactive form. And the type of this reactive form is going to be form group. Now, in order to work with this form group, we also need to import it from Angular/forms. So let's write that import statement. Okay. All right. Now here we have this error because here we are not assigning anything to this reactive form property. So if you want, you can also go ahead and you can assign a new instance of form group to this property. Okay. There you need to pass an object. So you can do this assignment here, but instead of doing this assignment here, I would like to do this assignment inside the ng on init lifecycle hook when all the properties are initialized. Okay, so for now to avoid this error, what I will do is I'll go to tsconfig.json and there for now I will set this strict property to false. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to app_component.ts and that error should be gone. Now we are going to assign this reactive form property with a new instance of form group in the ng on init lifecycle hook. For that, for this app component, we are going to implement on init interface. And in order to use this on init interface, we also need to import it from Angular/Go. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's implement ng on init interface. This ng on init lifecycle hook. And inside that, we are going to assign this reactive form with some value. So here, let's say this dot reactive form, and to this we want to assign an instance of form group. For that, first we need to use new keyword and then we need to call the constructor of form group, and to this constructor we need to pass an object, and inside this object we are going to specify what are the controls we want inside this form group, and we are going to specify it using key value pair. So for example, we want a first name form control. Okay, and to this first name we want to assign a form control. For that, again we will use new keyword and then we are going to call the constructor of form control. And again, in order to use this form control, we need to import it from Angular/forms. And here, let's move this import in this line and let's remove this import statement. All right, so in this way, inside this form group, we are creating a form control called first name. And to this form control, you can also pass the default value which you want to set for that form control. So currently I'll pass null. You can also pass empty string. Okay, so this will be the default value set for that form control. In the same way, let's also go ahead and let's define other form controls. For example, we also want a form control called last name. Then we also want a form control called email. We want a form control called username. We want a form control called date of birth. We want a form control called street address. So I'll simply call it as street. If I go to the web page, there you see we have this street. We also have this gender form control which we want, and we want country, city, region, and postal code. So let's also create a form control for gender. Then we have the form control for street. We want a form control for country. We want a form control for city. We want a form control for region. And finally, we also want a form control for postal code. So I'll simply call it as postal. So these are the form controls which we want in our form. Okay, so to create a form, we have used this form group class. We are calling its constructor. To that, we are passing an object. And inside that object, we are specifying what are the form controls we want for that form group. Now you might say, in template driven form approach, we had an object of type ng form. But here, in order to create a reactive form, we are using form group. So why is that? Well, keep in mind that ng form is also a type of form group. Okay, so when we import forms module from Angular/forms, then whenever it finds a form in the Angular application, it will automatically make it as template driven form. We don't need to explicitly use ng form on that form. Okay, but still that ng form is of type form group. That's because a form is nothing but it is a collection of form controls. And ng form is also storing a collection of form controls. Right. So ng form is also a form group. In the same way, when we are using reactive form approach, there also we are creating a form group, and in that form group, we have a collection of form controls. All right, now here we have defined the form structure. Now we need to connect this form, this reactive form, this form group which we have created here to the HTML form which we have defined in our view template. So basically to this form, we need to connect this reactive form. For that, on this form element, we need to use a directive, and that directive is form group. And this G should be caps here. And to this form group directive, we want to assign this reactive form property. So here we need to do property binding. For that, we will wrap this form group directive within square brackets like this. And then to this, we will assign this property, this reactive form property. And in this way, now this HTML form is connected with this reactive form group. And we also need to connect these controls to the respective controls in this HTML form. So for example, we need to connect this first name input element to this first name form control. Now, how are we going to do that? For that, on each of these form controls, we need to use another directive called form control name. And to this form control name, we need to assign the form control which we want this input element to connect to. In this case, we want this input element to be connected to this first name form control. So let's copy this first name from here and let's assign it here. Now here notice that we are not doing any property binding. So this value will be considered as string value. But if we do property binding like this, in that case, Angular will think that this first name is some TypeScript expression, right? So when we are doing property binding like this on the directive, then we need to wrap this value within single quotes because here we need to specify a string value. Keep this point in mind. But here I will not do property binding. I'll simply pass this first name as a string value to this form control name, and it should be form control name. And let's go ahead and let's do the same thing on other input elements. So we want to connect this last name input element to the last name form control. So here we will pass last name. So this last name, we have a form control inside this form group. Then we also have this email form control. So here in this next line, we want to connect this email input element to email form control. Then we want to connect this username input element to username form control. Let's do the same thing for other form controls. Then here for the gender, for each of these genders, we want to connect it to gender form control. So I'll remove this checked from here. And here we want to connect this form control, this radio button to gender form control. Let's do the same thing on other radio buttons. And here we don't need this name attribute now. Okay, so I'll remove it from here. Then let's scroll down. Here we have this drop down list. So we want to connect this drop down list to country form control. We want to connect the street address to street form control. Then let's scroll down. We want to connect the city input element to city form control. We want to connect this region input element to region form control. And we want to assign this postal code input element to postal form control. Okay, so in this way, using this form control name directive, we are connecting each of the form controls to the form control which we have defined inside this form group. And in order to connect this form group to the form, on that form, we are using form group directive. So now if we go to the web page, now this form is no more just a HTML form. Now it is a reactive form. Now, if you want to set some default value for some of the fields of this form, for example, let's say for this gender, I want to set the default value as male. And for the country, I want to set the default value as India. For that, let's go back to VS Code. And if I scroll down, here we have the gender radio button. This should be male. So I want to make this M in caps. And here also, let's make this P in caps. All right, so if you notice for each of the radio buttons, currently we are not providing any value attribute, right? So let's go ahead and let's provide a value attribute here. So for the male radio button, the value should be male. For the female radio button, the value should be female. And for this prefer not to say radio button, let's say the value should be other. And based on this value, we can set a default value. So for example, we want to make this input element checked by default. So we are going to pass this value to the gender control inside this form group. So here we have this gender control. Currently, for this gender control, we are passing the default value as null, but now we want to pass the default value as male. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now you will notice that by default, male is selected. In the same way, for this country dropdown, we want the default value to be India. So let's go back, and here we have our country control. There, let's specify the default value as India. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. And now you'll notice that India is selected by default. So in this way, you can also set a default value for your form controls. Now, when this form will be submitted, as we learned in the template driven form approach, when a form gets submitted, Angular raises an event called ng submit. And we can listen to that ng submit event. And whenever the form will be submitted, we can do something. So when this button will be clicked, since the type of this button, so if I go to app-component.html, if I scroll down, currently the type is button, but here let's set it to submit. Okay, so when the type is submit and when the button will be clicked, it is going to submit the form. And when the form will be submitted, in that case, ng submit event will happen. And we can listen to that ng submit event on this form itself, because when the submit button will be clicked, the complete form will be submitted. So the ng submit event will happen on the form. And we are listening to that ng submit event. And when this ng submit event happens, we want to execute some code. So here to this ng submit event, let's pass a method. Let's say on form submitted. And inside this on form submitted method, let's go ahead and let's write some logic. So let me copy this method name from here in the component class. Let's create that method. So after this ng on init, let's go ahead and let's create this method. And in there, I'm simply going to use console.log statement. And what do I want to log here? I want to log this reactive form property. So for that, I'll simply say this dot reactive form. So when we were using template driven approach, there what we had to do is on the form, we had to use a template reference variable. And to that template reference variable, we assigned ng form object. And then we were accessing that template reference variable using view child decorator, and then we were logging that template reference variable. But here we don't need to do anything like that. Here we can simply go ahead and log this reactive form property, because it is this reactive form property which is storing our form, right? So with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me open developer console. Let's go to console tab. Let me clear everything. And when I click on this submit button, you will notice that an object of type form group has been logged. If I expand this form group object, there we should have controls property. And if I expand this controls property, you will see that we have all our controls which we have defined inside that form group. So for example, city, country, date of birth, email, first name, gender, last name, postal, region, street, username, etc. And we should also have a value property. So here we have our value property. If I expand this value property, this is an object, and in that object, with the form control name, we have a property name, and the value for these properties is the value which we have entered in that form control. So currently for these form controls, we have not entered any value, but for those form controls where we have a default value, for example, for this gender and for this country form control, you will notice that the default values are already set. For the gender, male is set, and for the country, India is set. So we can use this value property to retrieve the value of each form control from this form. Let me clear the console here. Let's go ahead and let's enter some value in these fields. And now when I click on this submit button, again, this form group has been logged. If I expand this, and if I expand the value property here, you will notice that the values which we have entered in these form controls, that has been assigned here. And in this form group, you will also find other properties. For example, we have this invalid and valid property, which tells us whether the form is valid or not. We have this dirty property, which tells us whether the form is dirty or not. Then we also have this untouched property, and we should also have a touched property. So here we have the touched property, which tells us whether any form control in this form has been touched or not. So the structure of this form group object is very similar to the structure of the ng form object, which we learned about in the template driven form approach. Then for each of these form controls, in this controls property is an object, and in that object, for each of these form controls, a property will be created with the form control name, and to that property, the form control object will be assigned. So for example, if I expand any one of these form controls, let's say first name, there you will see the details related to that form control. For example, what is the status of that first name form control? It is valid. Whether the form controls value has changed or not. If it is changed, in that case, this pristine will be false and this dirty will be true. But if it has not changed, in that case, this pristine will be true and dirty will be false. Then we have this value property, which stores the value which we have entered inside this form control. So in this first name form control, we entered this value John, and that value you can see it is assigned to this value property. All right. So in this way, using this form group or using this form control object, we can retrieve the value which the user has entered inside the form control. And if you want to retrieve the value of all of the form controls from the given form, in that case, you can use the value property of form group. All right, so in this lecture, we learned how we can create a reactive form. Now, in the next lecture, let's learn how we can do validation on a reactive form.